10 minutes after the surgeon told them I might suffer permanent brain damage, my parents quietly walked out of the ICU to catch a flight to the Caribbean with my sister. I was lying unconscious beneath surgical lights with tubes running from my arms and wires tracking every heartbeat. The doctor had just explained that without immediate surgery, I might not survive the next 48 hours. My mother did not ask if I was in pain. She asked if my insurance would cover the procedure. My father checked his watch like he was waiting for a delayed flight. My sister Vanessa scrolled through her phone, complaining that the hospital smelled terrible. Then they left. 5 days later, my mother came back to the hospital smiling politely at the front desk and demanding that the staff discharge me immediately. The receptionist handed her the visitor log, and the moment she saw the name written on nearly every line for the past week, her smile vanished. The sound that ended my normal life had not been dramatic at all. It was only the thin crack of glass shattering against the laboratory floor. One moment, I was standing at my workstation inside the aquaculture research lab, studying a spreadsheet filled with oxygen saturation readings and fish growth ratios from an experimental system worth several $million in future agricultural investment. The next moment, the room tilted sideways and the glass beaker slipped from my fingers. The fluorescent lights stretched into long white streaks above me as if someone had pulled the world sideways. I remember reaching for the edge of the counter. My arm felt strangely heavy, like it belonged to someone else. Then the floor rushed upward. After that, there was nothing but darkness. My name is Jenna Thompson. I am 29 years old, and I hold a doctorate in agricultural science with a specialization in sustainable aquaculture systems. At the time of the collapse, I was leading a research program at the Pacific Sustainable Agriculture Center in Northern California. Our team was developing a closed-loop fish farming system designed to produce high-volume food without damaging natural ecosystems. From the outside, the job sounded calm and academic. People imagined quiet laboratories, thoughtful discussions, and slow scientific progress. The truth was much less peaceful. Every experiment we ran carried the weight of future commercial investment. Agricultural companies were watching closely. Environmental groups were skeptical. Venture capital firms were waiting for proof that the technology could scale. Years of work could disappear with a single failed dataset. That week, our project had reached its most critical stage. After nearly 3 years of experiments, we had finally gathered enough growth data to build a full commercial model. 2 agricultural corporations were reviewing our preliminary report, and an investment group had already scheduled a meeting to discuss funding for a large-scale production facility. If the numbers held, our system could transform sustainable aquaculture across several states. If the numbers collapsed, the entire program would quietly disappear into academic archives. That night, the research building was almost completely empty. Rows of aquaculture tanks stretched across the laboratory floor, each filled with filtered water slowly circulating through a maze of pipes and biological filtration units. Hundreds of juvenile fish moved through the gentle currents while sensors continuously measured oxygen concentration, nutrient levels, and waste recycling efficiency. Every number flowing into my spreadsheets represented months of carefully controlled experiments, and every decimal point mattered. I had been working for nearly 30 hours without real sleep. The final investment report had to be finished before morning. Investors wanted a clear summary of growth efficiency and waste conversion rates. The raw data looked promising, but scientific reports cannot rely on promising numbers. They require proof. At first, the pressure building behind my eyes felt like ordinary exhaustion. I rubbed my temples and leaned closer to the screen, adjusting one final set of graphs that tracked oxygen consumption against fish weight. Then the numbers began to blur. The headache sharpened suddenly, like a knife pressing behind my left eye. For a moment, my vision flickered as if someone had dimmed the lights inside my skull. I told myself I just needed water. I stood up slowly and reached for the glass beaker sitting beside the filtration console. The instant my fingers touched the glass, the room shifted violently. A wave of dizziness rolled through my head so suddenly that I barely had time to inhale. My right hand went numb. The beaker slipped from my fingers. Glass shattered across the laboratory tiles. My knees buckled as if invisible strings had been cut inside my body. I tried to call for help, but the words never reached my mouth. The lights stretched into glowing lines above me, and the floor surged upward. The last thing I remember seeing was the blinking cursor on my laptop screen, waiting patiently for the final paragraph of the report. Then everything disappeared. According to the hospital staff, a security guard making his midnight rounds found me lying unconscious beside the research tanks nearly 20 minutes later. By the time the ambulance reached Redwood Valley Medical Center, the doctors had already prepared the stroke emergency unit. A blood vessel in my brain had ruptured under extreme stress and exhaustion. Without immediate surgery, they estimated I had less than 48 hours before permanent brain damage. The hospital called my mother early the next morning. Linda Thompson. The nurse who later told me the story said my mother's first question was not about my condition. She asked whether my health insurance would pay for the surgery. My parents arrived at the hospital around 9:30 that morning with my sister Vanessa. By that time, the neurosurgery team had already begun preparing the operating room. My head was wrapped in thick bandages and medical monitors surrounded the bed. The surgeon calmly explained the risk of permanent brain damage. Vanessa wrinkled her nose and complained that hospitals smelled terrible. My father checked his watch again. And before noon, my family quietly walked out of the ICU to catch their flight to the Caribbean for my sister's destination wedding planning trip. What none of them knew was that someone else had already begun visiting my hospital room. Every single day. The visitor log at the front desk proved it. 5 days after brain surgery, the first voice from my family that reached me was not a message asking if I was alive. It was my sister screaming because her credit card had stopped working in the middle of a luxury resort in the Caribbean. The phone began vibrating on the small hospital table beside my bed only minutes after I revoked the card authorizations. I stared at the screen while the name flashed across it again and again. Vanessa Thompson. My younger sister rarely called unless something had gone wrong. The steady beeping of the heart monitor beside my bed filled the quiet room while the call continued ringing. Outside the door, I could hear the distant sound of hospital carts rolling across tile floors. Inside the room, nothing moved except the phone vibrating slowly against the table. I let the call ring until it stopped. The silence lasted less than 10 seconds before the screen lit up again. Vanessa Thompson. This time I answered. I did not even have time to speak before her voice exploded through the speaker. "Jenna, what did you do?" "My card just got declined at the resort restaurant." She sounded breathless and furious at the same time. I could hear music and laughter in the background, along with the distant crash of ocean waves. The contrast between that noise and the quiet hospital machines around me felt almost surreal. I leaned my head back against the pillow before answering slowly. "I revoked the card authorization, Vanessa." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 1 second before the shouting started again. "What do you mean you revoked it? I am in the middle of dinner. Do you know how embarrassing this is? Mom and Dad's cards stopped working too. The waiter is literally standing here waiting." I closed my eyes for a moment. The dull pressure in my skull pulsed with each heartbeat, but my thoughts felt clearer than they had in years. I had spent most of my adult life quietly absorbing the consequences of my family's decisions. For the first time, the balance had shifted. Vanessa continued talking without waiting for a response. "You need to fix this right now, Jenna. I swear if you ruined this trip, I am going to lose it. Do you have any idea how expensive this place is? Mom said the spa appointment alone was $800. I let her finish before speaking again. "I woke up from brain surgery this morning, Vanessa." There was a pause. Not concern, not surprise, only irritation breaking through the silence. "Yeah, Mom mentioned something about that, but you're obviously awake now, so can you just reactivate the card?" "The waiter is still here." I slowly turned my head toward the window beside the hospital bed. Early evening light filtered through the glass, casting pale reflections across the sterile floor tiles. For a long time, I had believed that family loyalty required endless patience. That belief had quietly drained $324,600 from my accounts over the past 7 years. I opened my eyes again and spoke calmly. No. Another silence followed. This one lasted longer. Then Vanessa's voice returned, colder now. What do you mean? No, I mean the cards are canceled and they are not coming back. Her breathing grew louder through the phone speaker. Jenna, this is ridiculous. Mom and Dad need those cards. You know they rely on you. I stared at the ceiling lights above my bed. For years, that exact sentence had been repeated in different forms during every family conversation about money. They rely on you. You are the responsible one. You make the most money. It is only temporary. Temporary had turned into 7 years. I spoke slowly, careful to keep my voice steady. I was unconscious in an ICU for 5 days, Vanessa. Did any of you come back to check on me? Her answer arrived instantly. We already visited the hospital. What more do you want from us? Mom said the doctors handled everything fine. Besides, this trip was scheduled months ago. You know how important the venue tour is for the wedding. I almost laughed, but the movement would have hurt my head too much. Instead, I simply closed my eyes again. The nurse who had been adjusting a medication pump glanced toward me quietly before leaving the room. Even she seemed to sense the tension in the conversation. Vanessa continued talking. Look, I do not understand why you are acting like this. Just turn the cards back on and we can talk about it when we get home. The waiter is still standing here, and Mom is getting really upset. Somewhere behind her voice, I heard my mother speaking sharply to someone in the background. My father said something else I could not quite understand. The sound of ocean wind carried through the phone microphone. I finally spoke again. I am not turning them back on Vanessa. Her response came immediately. Then how are we supposed to pay for dinner? The question hung in the air between us. I considered the answer carefully before speaking. The same way everyone else does, with your own money. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting. When Vanessa spoke again, her voice had lost its anger and shifted toward disbelief. Jenna, are you serious right now? Completely serious. Another pause stretched across the phone line. Then a second voice suddenly appeared in the background. My mother. Give me the phone. Vanessa muffled the speaker briefly before the device shifted hands. A moment later, my mother's voice replaced hers. Jenna, what is going on? Your sister says you canceled our credit cards. That is correct. Why would you do something like that? She demanded. Your father and I are on an important trip supporting your sister's wedding plans. You know, we do not have the money for these things ourselves. I listened to the familiar tone of calm entitlement in her voice and realized something important. For the first time in years, I did not feel obligated to solve the problem she was describing, because I was unconscious in a hospital bed for 5 days and none of you came back. The line went quiet. Then my mother answered with a dismissive sigh. Jenna, the doctors told us you were stable. There was no reason for all of us to sit around the hospital for a week. Vanessa's wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. I stared at the heart monitor beside my bed while the green line traced slow, steady rhythms across the screen. Stable. The surgeon had described my condition very differently when he spoke to the nurse earlier that afternoon. I had been less than 48 hours from permanent brain damage. Yet my family had categorized the situation as stable enough to board an international flight. I spoke again with the same calm tone. The cards are canceled, Mom. The conversation on the other end of the phone erupted immediately as my parents and sister began arguing with each other about what to do next. Their voices overlapped in confusion and frustration while resort music continued playing behind them. I quietly ended the call and placed the phone back on the bedside table. The device began vibrating again almost instantly. I ignored it. Instead, I looked at the spreadsheet still open in my cloud account and focused on the final number at the bottom of the page. $324,600. For years, that number had represented sacrifice. Tonight, it represented something else entirely, a boundary. And for the first time since waking up in the ICU, I felt something close to peace. The phone vibrated across the metal hospital table with a sharp buzzing sound that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet ICU room. Vanessa Thompson's name flashed across the screen again and again. I watched it for a moment before answering. Somewhere thousands of miles away, something expensive had just stopped working. I tapped the speaker button. "What the hell did you do?" Vanessa's voice exploded through the room before I could say anything. I could hear music and distant conversation behind her, the kind of lively background noise that only existed in expensive restaurants. "My card just got declined in the middle of dinner." I said nothing. "We're standing here with Gregory's parents and the manager is literally staring at us like we're criminals," she continued. "Fix it right now." The calm beeping of the heart monitor beside my bed continued, steady and indifferent. Vanessa's voice grew sharper as the silence stretched between us. "Jenna, are you even listening?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Then explain why my card stopped working." I shifted slightly against the pillow, the dull pressure inside my skull reminding me that my brain had been cut open less than a week earlier. "I canceled the authorizations," I said. There was a pause, followed by the sound of Vanessa exhaling in disbelief. "You can't just do that," she snapped. "We're literally in the middle of dinner." "I know." Another pause. Then a different voice came through the phone. "Jenna." My mother. Linda Thompson sounded irritated rather than concerned. I could hear wind moving through palm trees somewhere near her microphone and the distant clink of glasses from other diners. "What is going on with these cards?" she demanded. "The hotel account is also declining." I looked at the white hospital ceiling for a moment before answering. "I revoked the secondary cards connected to my account." "That's ridiculous," she said immediately. "You know we're in the Caribbean for Vanessa's wedding planning. These reservations were made months ago." The tone in her voice carried the same quiet authority she had used for years whenever she expected me to solve a problem without question. "You'll need to transfer $50,000, she added calmly. "The resort requires payment tonight." For a moment, I thought the medication in my bloodstream might be affecting my hearing. "50,000? I asked. "Yes," she said impatiently. "We can settle everything when we return home." I stared at the phone in my hand. 5 days earlier, I had been lying unconscious in a hospital operating room while surgeons worked to stop bleeding inside my brain. The people now demanding $50,000 had left the building before the surgery was even finished. "Do you know where I'm calling from?" I asked. My mother hesitated slightly. "You're still in the hospital, obviously," she replied. "But that doesn't change the situation." Her voice hardened. "Your sister's future in-laws are here, Jenna. Gregory's family expects a certain level of professionalism. We cannot embarrass ourselves like this." Vanessa spoke again in the background. "This is my wedding trip," she said angrily. "You're ruining everything." I closed my eyes briefly, letting the weight of the conversation settle into something clearer than anger. Not one of them had asked whether I could walk again. Not one had asked whether the doctors believed I would recover. They were only concerned about dinner bills. "I'm not transferring any money," I said. The reaction on the other end of the line was immediate. "You're being dramatic," my mother said sharply. "We'll discuss this when we get home." "No," I said. The single word landed with more finality than I expected. The conversation dissolved into overlapping voices as Vanessa and my mother began arguing at the same time. I did not wait for them to finish. I ended the call. The silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself. Outside the room, nurses moved quietly through the ICU hallway. Someone pushed a medical cart past the door, its wheels clicking softly across the tile floor. My phone vibrated again. Voicemail, then another, and another. I listened to the first message long enough to confirm what I already suspected. Vanessa was furious. My mother sounded embarrassed rather than worried. Both of them repeated the same demand. "Fix the cards, transfer the money, stop making a scene." None of the messages asked how I was feeling. I stopped playing them. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and stared at the ceiling again. The dull ache in my head pulsed slowly, but the clarity in my mind felt sharper than it had in years. For most of my adult life, I had believed I was supporting my family. Looking at the situation now, the system felt simpler. I had built the entire structure, My income funded their lifestyle. My credit supported their spending. My stability protected them from consequences. And the moment that system shut down, panic followed. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. One of the nurses stepped into the room holding a thin black binder. "Jenna," she said gently, "the hospital administration asked me to show you this." She placed the binder on the table beside my bed and opened it to a page filled with names and timestamps. The ICU visitor log. Every person who had entered the unit since my surgery was listed there. At the top of the page were the names I expected: Linda Thompson, Richard Thompson, Vanessa Thompson. Each appeared only once, but as my eyes moved further down the page, another name appeared again: Daniel Carter, and again, and again. 5 nights in a row. I looked up at the nurse. "Who is that?" I asked. She smiled slightly. "He's been waiting outside the ICU almost every evening," she said, "sometimes for hours." Before I could ask another question, the door behind her opened quietly. A tall man with silver hair stepped into the room. Daniel Carter had finally stopped waiting in the hallway. The man who stepped into my ICU room did not look like someone who had just wandered into the wrong place. He moved with the calm certainty of a person who already understood the situation before anyone else in the room did. The nurse stepped aside to let him pass, and he offered her a brief nod before turning his attention to me. For a few seconds, he simply stood near the foot of the bed, studying me carefully. He was older than my father, maybe in his early 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back and the kind of composed posture that comes from decades of authority. His suit was understated but expensive, the sort of clothing worn by people who do not need to prove their status. The nurse closed the binder containing the visitor log and placed it on the table beside my bed. "This is Mr. Carter," she said gently. "He's been here several nights." Then she quietly stepped out of the room, leaving us alone with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The man pulled a chair closer and sat down beside the bed, without hesitation, as if he had already spent hours in that exact spot. His movements were calm and deliberate. "You look better than you did yesterday," he said. His voice was deep and steady, the tone of someone used to speaking in situations where emotions ran high, but clarity was required. I glanced at the visitor log again. "You've been here every night," I said. "Yes." The answer was simple and direct. I studied his face, trying to connect it to some memory. Something about him felt familiar, but I could not place it. "I don't think we've met before," I said. "No," he replied. "We haven't." He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together. "But I've known about you for a long time, Jenna." The statement might have sounded unsettling under different circumstances, but there was no threat in his voice. Instead, it carried the strange weight of unfinished history. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said. The name triggered a faint recognition. I had seen it somewhere recently, not in person, but in documents, research proposals, investment briefings. My eyes narrowed slightly as the memory surfaced. "You're involved with the aquaculture project," I said slowly. He nodded. "My firm has been reviewing the long-term investment potential of the closed-loop farming system your team developed. Carter Environmental Ventures, one of the companies evaluating whether our research could expand into large-scale agricultural production." "But that still doesn't explain why you're here," I said. Daniel Carter glanced briefly toward the window before answering. "Because your father would have been here." The words landed quietly but heavily. "My father died when I was 9, I said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "He did." He paused, as if choosing the next words carefully. "Michael Thompson and I were research partners 20 years ago." The name pulled a distant memory from childhood. My father had been a marine biologist working on aquatic ecosystems long before sustainable aquaculture became a major scientific focus. I remembered photographs of him standing beside experimental tanks along the coast, smiling with the quiet confidence of someone who believed deeply in the future of his work. "You worked together?" I asked. "For several years," Daniel said. Your father believed aquaculture could eventually become one of the most important food systems in the world. My eyes moved toward the aquaculture data charts still saved on my phone. The research I had spent years developing suddenly felt connected to a past I barely understood. He would have been proud of what you're building, Daniel added. The statement caught me off guard. My mother never mentioned you, I said. Daniel Carter's expression shifted slightly. That was not her decision to make. The room grew quiet again. Before your father died, he continued, he made arrangements to protect your future. I frowned slightly. What kind of arrangements? Daniel reached down and lifted a leather briefcase from beside his chair. He opened it slowly and removed a thin folder filled with financial documents. A trust fund, he said. The phrase sounded strangely distant. My father set aside a financial account designed to support your education and research career, Daniel explained. He asked me to oversee it until you were ready to access the funds yourself. I stared at the folder in his hands. I've never heard anything about that. Daniel studied my reaction carefully. That, he said quietly, is exactly why I started reviewing the account again. He opened the folder and placed several pages on the table beside my bed. These are the financial records for the trust. The first number I saw was the original deposit. The amount was far larger than anything I had ever personally owned, but what caught my attention was the second column. Withdrawals. Page after page listed transactions stretching back more than a decade. Transfers, authorizations, and cash removals gradually drained the balance year by year. My chest tightened slightly. How much is missing? I asked. Daniel did not hesitate. A little more than $2 million. The number echoed through my mind like an impact. My hand reached for the documents and flipped to the signature lines authorizing each withdrawal. Every page carried the same handwritten name, Jenna Thompson. But the handwriting was not mine. Daniel watched my expression carefully. The signatures were forged, he said calmly. I stared at the pages for several seconds, my mind moving slowly through the implications. Only one person had ever handled my financial paperwork during graduate school. Only one person had asked me to sign broad authorization documents so she could simplify banking matters. My mother, Linda Thompson. Daniel Carter closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table. We have already begun reviewing the bank records, he said. I leaned back slowly against the pillow. So this isn't just a family problem, I said. Daniel met my eyes. No, he replied quietly. It's a financial crime. For several seconds, I stared at the forged signatures without saying anything. My own name repeated across the documents felt strangely distant, like I was looking at the financial history of someone else's life. The handwriting was close enough to fool a casual observer, but the small details were wrong. The angle of the letters, the pressure of the pen strokes. Someone had practiced copying my signature for years. How long? I finally asked. Daniel Carter answered without hesitation. The first unauthorized withdrawal appeared a little more than 10 years ago. 10 years. The number hit harder than the total amount. 10 years meant the theft had started when I was still in graduate school, when I was working 16-hour days inside university laboratories and trusting my mother to handle paperwork I did not have time to read carefully. My fingers slowly turned another page. The transactions were not random. The money had moved in steady patterns: tuition payments, mortgage transfers, retail purchases, luxury travel expenses. Each year, the trust account shrank while the lifestyle of my family improved. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair, watching my reaction. I reviewed the entire audit before coming here, he said. The withdrawals accelerated during the last 5 years. That timeline matched my own memories with uncomfortable precision. 5 years ago was when my research project began attracting large investors. It was also when my income increased dramatically. My mother had stopped pretending the money was temporary support. It had become an expectation. And the banks approved these withdrawals? I asked. Daniel nodded once. Because your mother used a legal document that gave her authority to manage certain financial accounts. A slow realization spread through my mind. The power of attorney, I said. Yes. I remembered signing that document during my second year of doctoral research. My schedule at the time had been brutal: field experiments during the day, lab analysis late into the night. My mother had insisted she could help manage my financial paperwork while I focused on finishing my degree. You were busy building your career, Daniel said quietly. She used that trust to gain access to the account. I looked down at the papers again. Every transaction had been carefully structured to appear legitimate. Small enough not to trigger automatic alarms, but large enough to drain the account over time. How did no one notice earlier? I asked. Daniel reached into the folder again and removed another sheet. This account was designed as a long-term trust, he explained. The funds were meant to remain largely untouched until you began accessing them directly. He pointed to a line of financial notes. Your mother reported that the withdrawals were being used to support your education and research expenses. The explanation made bitter sense. For years, my family had told relatives and neighbors that they were sacrificing financially so I could pursue advanced scientific work. In reality, they had been funding their own lifestyle with money meant for my future. The quiet anger building inside me felt very different from the emotional reactions I had experienced earlier in the hospital. This was colder, more precise. How solid is the evidence? I asked. Daniel's expression sharpened slightly. Extremely solid. He tapped the document in front of me. These signatures were verified against your real handwriting. They're not identical. A forensic examiner will confirm that easily. He flipped another page. And there's more. The next document contained bank security records, images from surveillance cameras inside a financial branch office. 2 people stood at the service desk speaking with a bank employee. I recognized them instantly, my mother and Vanessa. They looked relaxed in the photos, almost cheerful, as if they were completing routine financial tasks. When was this taken? I asked. 3 months ago, Daniel said. The date sat in the corner of the image. 3 months earlier, I had been working 18-hour days finalizing the aquaculture report that could secure millions in research funding. While I was building the future of sustainable agriculture, my family had been emptying the account that my father created to protect me. What happens next? I asked quietly. Daniel closed the folder and rested his hands on the edge of the hospital table. My legal team is already preparing the documentation, he said. Forgery, identity theft, and financial fraud at this level fall under federal investigation. I exhaled slowly. For most of my life, the idea of taking legal action against my own family would have felt impossible. Now it felt inevitable. They're still in the Caribbean, I said. For the moment. Daniel studied me carefully. But that situation will change very soon. I understood immediately. Once the credit cards stopped working and the banks began reviewing the trust account, my mother would start searching for answers. Eventually, she would come back to the only place she believed she still had control. Me. What are you planning? I asked. Daniel's voice remained calm. I'm planning to give them a choice. He reached into the briefcase again and removed a second folder. Inside were legal documents, neatly organized and already prepared. If your mother signs these admissions of debt, he said, she will transfer all remaining assets connected to the stolen funds. And if she refuses? Daniel met my eyes without hesitation. Then the FBI becomes involved. The quiet confidence in his voice made the outcome feel almost inevitable. Somewhere in the Caribbean, my family was probably still enjoying tropical beaches and expensive restaurants. But the system that had supported their lifestyle for a decade was already collapsing, and they had no idea what was waiting for them when they came back. The hospital room felt unusually quiet the next afternoon, the kind of silence that always comes right before something inevitable arrives. I had been awake most of the morning reviewing the documents Daniel had left with me. The financial records were no longer shocking. They were simply data points in a system that had finally revealed its true structure. Shortly after noon, the door to the ICU room opened abruptly. My mother walked in first. Linda Thompson looked exactly the way she always did after returning from a vacation. Her skin carried the warm bronze color of tropical sun, and she wore the same expensive sunglasses she often posted in photos online. My father followed behind her, looking irritated rather than concerned, and Vanessa entered last, dragging a suitcase that still had airport tags attached. They had come straight from the airport. My mother stopped at the foot of my bed and crossed her arms. "So," she said sharply, "are you done with this little tantrum?" The heart monitor beside me continued its steady rhythm. I did not move. "You embarrassed us in front of Gregory's entire family," Vanessa added angrily. "Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" I looked at her for a moment. The same sister who had not once asked if I survived brain surgery was now furious about a declined credit card. My mother stepped closer to the bed. "We had to borrow money just to leave the resort," she continued. "Do you realize what that does to our reputation?" Her voice carried the familiar tone of someone who expected the conversation to end with me apologizing and fixing the problem. Instead, I said nothing. The silence seemed to irritate her even more. "You're going to reactivate those cards," she said, "and you're going to transfer the money we asked for." Vanessa nodded aggressively beside her. "This whole thing has gone too far." My father finally spoke, his voice low and impatient. "You've always been dramatic, Jenna, but this is ridiculous." I slowly reached for the folder resting on the hospital table beside my bed. "Before we talk about money," I said calmly, "I need to ask you something." My mother frowned. "What now?" I opened the folder and pulled out one of the financial statements Daniel had shown me earlier. "Do you recognize this account?" I asked. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Then it disappeared. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she replied quickly. I turned the page and revealed the trust documentation. "The account was created 20 years ago," I continued, "by my father." My mother's expression tightened slightly. "That was a long time ago," she said dismissively. "Yes," I replied, "but the withdrawals from it are much more recent." Vanessa glanced at the papers but clearly had no idea what they meant. "What is this even about?" she asked. I slid the surveillance photos across the table. My mother's hand froze when she saw them. The images showed her and Vanessa standing inside the bank branch 3 months earlier. For several seconds, no one spoke. My father leaned forward slightly, trying to understand the situation. "Linda," he said quietly. My mother recovered quickly, forcing a tight smile. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're accusing your own family of something based on a few meaningless documents?" Before I could respond, the chair in the corner moved. Daniel Carter stood up. He had been sitting silently near the window the entire time. My mother's confidence vanished instantly. For a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. "Daniel," she whispered. Vanessa turned toward him in confusion. "Who is that?" Daniel stepped forward slowly and placed another folder on the hospital table. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said calmly, "and I oversee the trust account created by Michael Thompson." The room grew very still. My father looked between us in confusion. "What trust account?" he asked. Daniel opened the folder and revealed the full audit report. "Over the past decade," he continued, "more than $2 million have been withdrawn from this account using forged signatures and fraudulent authorization." My mother's face turned pale beneath the tan from the Caribbean sun. "That's not true," she said quickly. Daniel slid the documents closer to her. "The handwriting analysis says otherwise." He pointed toward the surveillance photos. "And the bank cameras confirm who conducted the transactions." Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. "Mom?" My father stared at the documents, his expression slowly shifting from confusion to alarm. "You told me that money was from Jenna's research grants," he said. My mother did not answer. Daniel's voice remained calm. "My legal team is waiting outside the room," he said. "If these admissions of debt are not signed within the next hour, the case will be forwarded to federal investigators." He placed a pen on top of the documents. This is the only opportunity you will have to settle this privately." The room felt suddenly smaller. My mother looked at the papers, then at me. For the first time since she entered the room, there was no anger in her eyes. Only fear. Her hand slowly reached toward the pen. My mother's hand hovered over the pen for several long seconds, trembling slightly as if the weight of it had suddenly become unbearable. The room remained silent, except for the steady electronic rhythm of the heart monitor beside my bed. Every person in the room understood exactly what the document represented: confession, debt, the collapse of a system that had protected her for more than a decade. Linda Thompson slowly picked up the pen. Vanessa stepped forward immediately. "Mom, what are you doing?" she whispered urgently. My mother did not answer. Her eyes remained locked on the legal pages spread across the hospital table. My father looked from the documents to Daniel Carter and then back to my mother. "Linda," he said quietly, "tell me this isn't real." She still said nothing. Daniel spoke instead. "These documents acknowledge the unauthorized withdrawals from the trust fund," he said calmly. "They also authorize the transfer of remaining personal assets connected to those funds." My father's voice grew sharper. "You're saying my wife stole $2 million? Daniel did not react to the accusation. "I'm saying the bank records show repeated withdrawals using forged signatures," he replied. "If this paperwork is not signed today, federal investigators will handle the matter." Vanessa shook her head in disbelief. "This is insane," she said. "Jenna, you're seriously doing this to your own family?" I met her eyes without raising my voice. "No," I said. "You did this." The words seemed to land harder than anything else spoken in the room. For years, my family had framed every financial problem as something I needed to fix. Every crisis eventually returned to the same solution. Jenna would take care of it. Now the system had reversed. My mother finally spoke, her voice strained and quiet. "How much?" she asked. Daniel answered immediately. "The current calculated amount of stolen funds is $2,130,000. Vanessa gasped softly. "That can't be right." My father stared at my mother, waiting for a denial that never came. "You told me the trust account barely had anything in it," he said slowly. Linda Thompson looked exhausted for the first time since entering the room. "I handled the finances," she muttered. Daniel remained perfectly calm. "The repayment agreement transfers the remaining property assets connected to those withdrawals," he explained, "including the house purchased in 2019. My father's head snapped up. "Our house?" Daniel nodded once. "The property was purchased with funds originating from the trust account." Vanessa's voice turned frantic. "You can't take our house," Daniel corrected her quietly. "It was never yours to begin with." The reality of the situation finally settled across the room like a slow-moving shadow. My mother lowered the pen onto the document. For a moment, she looked directly at me. "You're really going to let this happen," she said. Her voice carried a mixture of disbelief and resentment, as if she still believed I had the power to stop the consequences unfolding in front of her. I answered honestly. "Yes." She looked down at the papers again. For 30 years, my mother had controlled nearly every financial decision in our family. She had been the person who approved spending, managed paperwork, and dictated what sacrifices everyone else needed to make. Now the control had disappeared. Her hand began moving slowly across the page. Signature 1, admission of unauthorized withdrawals. Signature 2, transfer of property assets. Signature 3, agreement to financial restitution. Each stroke of the pen erased another piece of the life she had built using money that was never hers. When she finished signing the final page, the room felt strangely empty. Daniel collected the documents and reviewed them carefully. "Thank you," he said calmly. My father sank into the chair near the wall, staring at the floor. Vanessa looked completely lost. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel closed the folder. "Now the bank will process the asset transfers," he replied. "And the criminal investigation?" my father asked quietly. Daniel paused. That depends on how quickly the repayment process proceeds. The tension in the room shifted slightly. My mother understood immediately. Signing the documents had not erased the crime. It had only delayed the consequences. Vanessa turned toward me again, her voice filled with anger. "You just destroyed our entire family." For a moment, I thought about the years I had spent working endless hours to support them. The nights in laboratories, the weekends spent reviewing data while my family traveled and shopped with money I had earned. Then I looked back at her. "No," I said calmly. "You did that a long time ago." Daniel walked toward the door and opened it. Two attorneys who had been waiting outside stepped into the room to finalize the paperwork. As they began reviewing the signed documents, I leaned back against the hospital pillow and closed my eyes briefly. For the first time in years, the financial structure that had quietly controlled my life was gone. The system had been dismantled, and there was nothing left for my family to take. 3 months later, I walked out of the rehabilitation wing of Redwood Valley Medical Center with a thin silver scar hidden beneath my hair and a life that looked nothing like the one I had left behind. The autumn air in Northern California felt colder than I remembered, but it also felt cleaner somehow. During the weeks after my surgery, I had learned to walk steadily again, to hold a pen without my fingers shaking, and to trust my mind after the hemorrhage that nearly ended everything. Recovery had not been dramatic. It was slow, repetitive, and sometimes exhausting. But each day, my strength returned a little more. By the time the doctors cleared me to return to work, the rest of my life had already begun changing. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Within 30 days of the documents being signed, the house my parents had purchased using the stolen trust funds was transferred into the restitution process. The property was sold almost immediately, and most of the recovered money went back into the trust account my father had created 2 decades earlier. The federal investigation did not disappear either. The signed confession had prevented immediate criminal charges, but financial crimes at that scale still required review. My mother and father were now living in a small rented apartment while their attorneys negotiated repayment schedules with the banks and Daniel's legal team. Vanessa's situation unraveled even faster. The wedding she had spent months planning collapsed within a week. Gregory's family, who had originally been impressed by the image of wealth and stability my family presented, quickly ended the engagement when the financial scandal became public through court filings. Without access to my credit cards or the constant transfers I had been sending for years, Vanessa's online influencer career also faded quickly. Her social media accounts still existed, but the luxury trips and designer products that once filled her posts had disappeared. Meanwhile, my own life moved forward in ways I had never fully allowed before. The aquaculture research project resumed shortly after I returned to the Pacific Sustainable Agriculture Center. During my recovery, Daniel Carter's investment firm had finalized its evaluation of the technology my team developed. The closed-loop farming system designed to recycle water and nutrients in aquaculture operations turned out to be far more scalable than investors originally believed. 3 weeks after I returned to the lab, Daniel's firm approved a multi-million-dollar investment to expand the program into commercial production facilities across California and Oregon. The project that once kept me working late nights alone in research tanks had suddenly become one of the largest sustainable agriculture initiatives on the West Coast. But the most important change was not financial. One morning, several weeks after returning to work, I caught my reflection in the glass wall of the laboratory while adjusting a monitoring sensor on one of the aquaculture tanks. For a moment, I paused and looked at the faint scar near my hairline. For years, I had believed the most valuable thing I could offer the world was usefulness. If I worked harder, earned more, solved more problems, then maybe the people around me would finally treat me like family. The stroke forced me to confront something much simpler. Real family does not disappear when you collapse in an ICU room. Real family does not measure love through bank transfers. Real family stays. Daniel stopped by the research center later that afternoon to review the progress of the new expansion plans. We spent several hours discussing water filtration models, crop integration systems, and how the project might expand internationally in the future. When the meeting ended, he paused near the door of the lab. "Your father would have liked this place," he said quietly. I smiled slightly. "I think he would have liked the work." Daniel nodded once before leaving. As the evening light faded outside the building, I walked through the research facility one more time before heading home. Tanks of circulating water moved slowly through the filtration system we had spent years designing. Every pump, sensor, and biological filter worked together in a balanced cycle. For the first time in my life, my own world felt balanced too. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your family, the person expected to give everything while receiving nothing in return, remember something important. Your value was never meant to be measured by how much you sacrifice for people who refuse to stand beside you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is close the account on a toxic system and start building a life that actually belongs to you. And if this story resonated with you, if you believe that real justice sometimes begins the moment we choose ourselves, then stay with us here on the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next story where someone finally takes their life back. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.